Alexander Knight, a ruthless billionaire, marries a scarred beggar on a cruel bet, only to uncover a shocking truth on their wedding night. Beneath the disguise lies a woman with secrets, fire, and a past that could destroy them both. What started as a game turns into a deadly obsession and love. The chandelier cast a golden glow across the vast ballroom, illuminating the faces of the city's elite. Laughter, the clinking of expensive champagne glasses, and the murmuring of business deals filled the air. Alexander Knight, the youngest billionaire in the room, leaned lazily against the bar, a smirk playing on his lips. Women eyed him hungrily, men envied him. He was used to it. Money, power, and charm had always been his weapons. He had never lost a bet, never failed a challenge. That's why when his best friend and business partner Damien leaned in with a wicked glint in his eye, Alexander knew something interesting was coming. "I bet you can get any woman in this room into your bed within an hour," Damien taunted, swirling his drink. Alexander chuckled, unimpressed. "That's too easy. Give me a real challenge." Damien's grin widened. "All right then. I dare you to marry the ugliest, most pathetic woman you can find. One night. If you succeed, I'll give you full control of the Blackwood deal." Alexander's smirk faltered for a second. The Blackwood deal was worth billions. He had been eyeing it for months, but the competition was brutal. If he could secure full control, it would make him one of the most powerful men in the country. He exhaled slowly, rolling the thought around in his mind. Marry a disgusting woman? Just for a night? It didn't matter. He had played worse games before. "Done," he said, tipping his glass toward Damien. The group erupted in laughter and excitement, already eager to see the humiliation unfold. It was past midnight when Alexander stepped out of his sleek black car onto the darkened streets of the city. His coat billowed in the cold wind as he scanned his surroundings with a calculating gaze. He had told his driver to take him to the dirtiest, poorest part of town, a place where he was sure to find his bride. He strolled through alleys filled with broken glass, the scent of rain and garbage mixing in the air. Homeless people huddled in corners, avoiding his gaze. Then he saw her. She was curled up on the steps of an abandoned shop, her body wrapped in a tattered brown coat. Her face was half hidden beneath long, tangled strands of dark hair. But what little he could see was scarred, worn, and dirty. She wasn't just poor, she was invisible to the world. For some reason, something deep inside him stirred. Not pity, not curiosity. Something unexplainable. He approached, his leather shoes clicking against the wet pavement. "You," he said, his voice smooth, authoritative. "Stand up." The woman didn't react at first. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Alexander felt his breath catch for a fraction of a second. Her eyes were golden. Not brown, not hazel, a deep, piercing gold, like fire trapped in amber. But the moment passed, and he reminded himself, this was just a game. "I have a deal for you," he said, stuffing his hands into his coat pocket. "Marry me. For one night. In return, you'll have food, clothes, and a place to stay." The woman's lips parted slightly, as if in shock. Then, to his surprise, she laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was soft, sad, almost knowing. "You think you can buy anything, don't you?" she said, her voice rough but laced with an edge of intelligence. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I don't think. I know." She went silent, staring at him for what felt like an eternity. Then she did something that shocked him. She stood up. Even in rags, covered in dirt, there was something graceful about her movements. "All right," she said simply. "I'll marry you." No questions, no hesitation. Something about that unnerved Alexander. What kind of beggar agreed to marry a billionaire without flinching? But he shook the thought away. It didn't matter. This was just a game, one he was sure he would win. The next morning, the media exploded. "Billionaire Alexander Knight marries a homeless woman. Ugliest bride in the world? What is Alexander thinking? Reporters swarmed the chapel, cameras flashing as Alexander stepped out of his limousine. He adjusted his designer suit, smirking at the chaos. Then, the chapel doors opened. Evelyn, his bride, stood at the entrance. She wore a plain, oversized white dress, her face hidden beneath a thick veil. Her hands trembled slightly, but otherwise she walked forward with a steady, eerie calm. Alexander's friends sat in the front row, snickering, whispering, "Man, he really did it. This is insane. What's wrong with her? She's not even reacting." But Alexander barely heard them, because as Evelyn reached him, standing just inches away, he felt something shift in the air. He should have been laughing at her. He should have been thinking about how to humiliate her after this was over. But all he could think about was the way she stood. Strong despite the ridicule, silent despite the judgment. And then she spoke one last time before the vows. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Mr. Knight?" she murmured, her voice so low that only he could hear. A chill ran down his spine. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure of anything. The chapel was a grand, Gothic structure, standing tall in the heart of the city. Journalists and photographers crowded outside, their cameras flashing like a violent storm, capturing every moment of the most bizarre wedding of the decade. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The guests, elite billionaires, business moguls, and celebrities, whispered among themselves, barely containing their amusement. Alexander Knight, the city's most eligible billionaire, was marrying a homeless woman. The whispers grew louder as Evelyn stepped through the doors. Dressed in an ill-fitting plain white gown, her face was hidden behind a thick veil of ivory lace. The fabric obscured her features, but her small, delicate frame made it clear that she was nothing like the women who usually graced Alexander's arm. She walked slowly, deliberately, her posture unnervingly composed for someone who had spent her life on the streets. Alexander stood at the altar watching her approach with unreadable eyes. His friends, seated in the front row, barely suppressed their laughter. "Man, this is insane. He actually went through with it. What's wrong with her? She's not even reacting." But Evelyn didn't flinch. She kept walking, her veil fluttering slightly as she finally stood beside Alexander. The priest cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing between the bride and groom. Even he seemed to feel the absurdity of the situation. "We are gathered here today," he began, but the words felt empty. The vows were exchanged in a dull murmur, the room filled with suppressed chuckles. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "You may now kiss the bride," the priest announced. A hush fell over the guests. Alexander turned to Evelyn, his smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He had expected her to look down, to tremble, to hesitate, but instead, she lifted her chin slightly. Even though her face was still hidden behind the veil, he could feel her eyes burning into him. Golden, watchful, unafraid. The smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Something about her unnerved him. Ignoring the strange feeling creeping up his spine, he lifted the veil. The guests leaned forward, eager to see the infamous ugly bride. But just before the fabric revealed her face, she turned her head slightly, just enough to keep her scars hidden. Alexander hesitated. His fingers hovered near her jaw, almost instinctively trying to turn her face back toward him. But before he could, she gently placed a hand on his chest, a soft, fleeting touch, yet it sent a strange, electric sensation through him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't force himself to lift the veil completely. Instead, he brushed his lips against her cheek, barely a touch. The guests erupted into laughter. Not even a real kiss. Looks like he couldn't bring himself to do it. Damn, this is brutal. Alexander let out a breath, stepping back. Why did he feel so unsettled? Evelyn lowered her veil again, turning toward the crowd. She didn't react to their laughter. She didn't shrink. She didn't flinch. And, for some reason, That bothered him more than anything. The reception was held at one of the most exclusive hotels in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and an orchestra played soft classical music in the background. The guests were drunk on expensive wine, laughing and gossiping about the spectacle they had just witnessed. Alexander sat at the head table, Evelyn beside him. She hadn't said much since the ceremony. She simply sat there, hands folded in her lap, her veil still in place. "Enjoying yourself, darling," Alexander drawled, leaning toward her. She turned her head slightly, her voice calm and unreadable. "Are you?" He blinked. For some reason he had expected her voice to be weak, hesitant, but it wasn't. It was soft but steady, unshaken. Damien, still grinning from the bet, leaned over from the other side of the table. "So, Mrs. Knight, tell us, what's it like to marry a billionaire overnight?" The table burst into laughter. Evelyn slowly lifted her glass of champagne, her fingers delicate against the crystal. "I imagine it's the same as being poor overnight," she said smoothly. "It only matters if you care about the change." The laughter died instantly. Damien frowned, clearly taken aback. "What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, those golden eyes watching him through the veil. "It means I don't care about the money, Mr. Calloway." She took a slow sip of champagne. "Do you?" A strange silence fell over the table. For the first time, Alexander saw Damien's smile slip. The moment lasted barely a second, but Alexander noticed. Damien was one of the most arrogant, untouchable men in their social circle. But in that instant, when Evelyn spoke, he looked uncomfortable. Why? Before Alexander could think too deeply about it, Damien forced a chuckle, clinking his glass against Alexander's. "Well, I'd say you definitely won the bet," he joked, regaining his confidence. "Not only did you marry a beggar, but you married one with an attitude." More laughter followed, and just like that, the tension passed. But Alexander's curiosity had been sparked. Who the hell was Evelyn? After the reception, Alexander led Evelyn to his mansion. The grand estate was silent as they stepped inside, the staff having retired for the night. He turned to her, studying the way she stood, tall, composed, as if she belonged there. "You're an unusual woman," he murmured. Evelyn removed her veil but kept her face turned away from the light. "So I've been told." Her voice was calm, unreadable. Alexander moved closer, watching her intently. "Most women would be either terrified or thrilled to be in your position," he said. "But you don't seem to care at all." Evelyn slowly turned to him, her golden eyes meeting his once more. "And what makes you think I don't care?" she asked softly. There was no emotion in her tone, no fear, no excitement, just a quiet challenge. Something inside Alexander's chest tightened. For the first time since this bet started. He wasn't sure if he had won. The grand mansion stood in eerie silence as Alexander Knight led his new bride inside. The vast marble floors reflected the golden glow of the chandelier, stretching out beneath them like an endless sea of wealth. Evelyn walked beside him, not behind him, her steps light yet deliberate. Her presence was quiet, yet undeniably strong, and that unsettled Alexander more than he cared to admit. This was supposed to be a joke, a meaningless bet, a night of amusement. But nothing about Evelyn felt like a joke anymore. He had been waiting for her to react, to show fear, excitement, or even the shame of being an unwanted bride. Instead, she remained calm, unreadable. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, irritation flickering in his chest. Why wasn't she nervous? He led her up the grand staircase to the master bedroom, expecting her to hesitate, to fidget, to look at him with fear. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to him just as they reached the door, her golden eyes burning into his like molten fire. "Are you going to stand there all night?" she murmured. "Or are you going to open the door?" Alexander's grip tightened on the handle. Damn her. The bedroom was massive, lined with dark velvet drapes and illuminated by the soft glow of a chandelier. A king-sized bed stood at the center, its silk sheets untouched. Evelyn stepped inside first, her gaze sweeping over the room. Alexander shut the door behind them and turned to face her, arms crossed. "This is the part where you get nervous," he said, watching her reaction closely. She tilted her head. "Is that what you want?" His jaw clenched. He had expected her to be meek, afraid, desperate. Instead, she was challenging him. With slow, deliberate movements, Evelyn reached up to the delicate lace veil, still covering part of her face. Alexander watched, his heart beating faster for some damn reason he didn't understand. As the veil dropped, he stopped breathing. Beneath the grime and scars, beneath the layers of filth she had worn like armor. She was stunning. Not in a delicate, fragile way. Her beauty was sharp, untamed, fierce, high cheekbones, full lips, and those haunting golden eyes. Alexander felt a strange tightness in his chest, an unfamiliar loss of control. "What the hell?" he muttered. Evelyn simply stood there, letting him absorb the truth. "I don't understand," he said, stepping closer, his voice lower, rougher. You looked ugly," she finished for him, her lips tilting into the faintest ghost of a smile. His eyes flickered to the scars on her cheek, which he now realized were fake, carefully crafted distortions. "Why would you do this?" he demanded. "Why the disguise?" Evelyn sighed, her expression unreadable. "Because, Mr. Knight, some women don't have the luxury of showing the world who they really are." Something in her tone sent a chill down his spine. He took another step closer, close enough to see the slight shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. "You're hiding from someone," he realized. "Aren't you?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Then, for the first time, he saw something in her eyes. Pain. Deep. Unhealed. Ancient. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice quieter now. A long silence stretched between them. Alexander had planned to humiliate her, to make this a ridiculous, meaningless bet. But now he wasn't sure what the hell he had walked into. Evelyn turned away from him, walking toward the fireplace at the edge of the room. The flickering flames cast golden reflections against her skin. "You must have enemies, Mr. Knight," she murmured. "Powerful ones." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "I have plenty." She nodded as if she had expected that answer. "And tell me, how many of them would kill to see you destroyed?" Alexander didn't answer, because he knew the number was too high to count. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I know what it's like to be hunted," she said. "To be chased until you're nothing but a shadow of who you used to be." Alexander frowned. "Who are you running from?" She turned to face him again, and for the first time that night, her expression softened. "People who wouldn't think twice about putting a knife in my back," she said. "People you might know." His heart pounded, something sharp curling in his chest. This was not what he had signed up for. He had married a beggar for a bet, not a woman with secrets that could kill her, and yet, he couldn't look away from her. The room grew dangerously silent as Alexander tried to make sense of the situation. The golden glow of the fire reflected in Evelyn's eyes as she watched him, waiting. Waiting for him to say something. Waiting for him to decide what to do with her. And for the first time in his life, Alexander didn't know what he wanted. She was beautiful. But that wasn't what bothered him. It was the way she made him feel. Like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that, for the first time, he couldn't control. He let out a slow breath, stepping closer. Too close. Evelyn's gaze flickered to his lips for the briefest second. So fast, he almost missed it. Something in his chest tightened painfully. This was supposed to be a joke, a bet. But now he wasn't sure who was playing who. And worse, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to win anymore. Alexander Knight had spent his life controlling everything, his business, his image, his lovers. But tonight, as he lay awake in the vast emptiness of his mansion, control felt like a distant thing. Evelyn, The woman he had married on a bet. The woman who had turned out to be breathtakingly beautiful beneath her disguise. The woman who was hiding from something, or someone. He turned in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He should have felt indifferent. Amused, even. Instead, he felt intrigued, irritated, curious, and, worst of all, drawn to her. The morning came, but the strange tension of the night before hadn't left. Alexander found Evelyn standing in front of the large windows of the dining hall, bathed in the golden morning light. She wore one of his silk robes, slightly too big for her frame, the loose fabric slipping off one of her shoulders. For a second, just 1 second, something dangerous coiled in his chest, but he shook it off. This was a game, a bet, nothing more. "You look comfortable," he remarked, pouring himself a coffee. Evelyn glanced at him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "Your house is warm. I haven't felt warmth in a long time." Something about that simple statement made his grip tighten on his mug. "How long?" he asked casually, watching her reaction. Evelyn exhaled softly. "Years." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Years? No normal beggar survived on the streets that long, not without losing themselves." She turned back to the window, watching the city below. "You still want to know who I am, don't you?" Alexander leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You're a liar, that's what you are." Her lips twitched, amused. "I never lied." "No?" He stepped closer. "So you just happen to be the most beautiful beggar in the world? Just happen to be able to walk into high society without flinching? Just happen to know how to play the game better than most?" Evelyn turned to face him fully now, her golden eyes serious, unreadable. "I didn't lie," she said softly. "I just let you believe what you wanted." His breath hitched for a second. Damn her. She was always a step ahead. Alexander placed his coffee down, stepping closer. Too close. "Who are you really, Evelyn?" His voice was lower now, more dangerous. She didn't back away. Instead, she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with an unshaken calmness. "I was once someone," she said, "before the world decided I wasn't." Alexander's stomach tightened. That wasn't an answer. That was a warning. "Explain," he demanded. She sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. For the first time, she looked tired. "My real name," she said quietly, "is Evelyn Sinclair." The name hit him like a punch. Sinclair. As in the Sinclair family. The ones who had been destroyed in one of the biggest scandals in the business world. A decade ago, the Sinclair empire had collapsed overnight. The family accused of fraud, conspiracy, and betrayal. Some had disappeared, some had been arrested, and the daughter, the only heir, had been declared dead. And yet, here she was, standing right in front of him. Alexander inhaled sharply. "You're supposed to be dead." Evelyn let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Yes, that was the idea." Alexander pulled out a chair, sitting down. His mind raced through 100 different questions. "Why did you hide?" he asked finally. Evelyn's expression darkened. "Because my family was betrayed." He watched her carefully. "By who?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she whispered, "People in your world, Alexander." His blood ran cold. "My father trusted the wrong people. He was framed. His business partners turned against him. Our wealth was taken, our name was destroyed. The men who did it, they didn't just want us ruined." She exhaled shakily. "They wanted us dead." Alexander stayed silent. He knew how this world worked. If someone was a threat, they were erased. And if Evelyn had survived, it meant someone out there still wanted her dead. "You should have left the city," he murmured. "I tried," she said, "but I needed to know the truth. I needed to know who was behind it all." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, then he stood abruptly, walking toward the window. "You're saying," he said carefully, "that the men who destroyed your family might be the same men sitting at my table." Evelyn's voice was soft but certain. "Yes." Alexander let out a slow, heavy breath. This was supposed to be a joke, a bet, a meaningless night. But instead he had walked into something far more dangerous. He turned back to her, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. "And marrying me?" he asked, his voice sharper now. "Was that just convenience? Protection?" Evelyn hesitated. Then she smiled, small, unreadable, but real. "No, Alexander," she murmured. "That was just fate." For the first time in his life, Alexander felt out of control. His entire world had been turned upside down. The woman he had married for a bet wasn't some homeless beggar. She was the survivor of one of the biggest betrayals in history. And now, her enemies were his enemies. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to cut ties before he got too deep. But as he looked at her, at the fire in her golden eyes, at the strength in the way she stood, he realized something terrifying. He didn't want to walk away. And worse, he didn't think he could. Alexander Knight had built his empire by being ruthless. He didn't hesitate. He didn't get attached. But as he sat in his study that night, his whiskey glass half empty on the polished mahogany desk, he realized he had made a mistake. He had underestimated Evelyn Sinclair. She wasn't some fragile beggar. She was a woman with secrets, power, and a past that could shake the foundation of his world. And now he was part of it. The next morning, Alexander found Evelyn standing on the balcony of their shared bedroom, dressed in a silk robe that barely clung to her delicate frame. The sunlight danced on her dark hair, and for a moment, just a moment, he forgot that their marriage was built on a lie. She turned, her golden eyes locking onto his. "You're staring," she murmured. Alexander leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I'm trying to figure you out." A slow smile curved her lips. "And what have you discovered?" He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, his presence towering over her smaller frame. "That I don't like the idea of people looking for you." Evelyn's amusement faded slightly. "And why does that bother you?" His jaw clenched. "Because whether I like it or not, you're my wife." The words hung heavy between them. Alexander wasn't a man who tied himself to anything or anyone. And yet the idea of someone trying to take her from him unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Evelyn tilted her head. "Is that what this is? Possession?" He stepped closer. Too close. Close enough to see the way her breath hitched slightly as he leaned down, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I don't like people taking what's mine." Evelyn didn't step back. Instead, she let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Careful, Mr. Knight." She met his gaze with that quiet fire he was coming to crave. "You almost sound like you care." That night, Alexander hosted a private gathering at the mansion, a meeting with powerful business associates. He had intended to keep Evelyn away from it. But when he walked into the grand hall, he found her seated at the center of attention, engaged in conversation with none other than Damien Calloway. Damien, the man who had made the bet that started it all. Alexander's muscles tensed as he watched them. Damien leaned in too close, a smirk playing on his lips. "So, tell me, Evelyn, what's it really like being married to the great Alexander Knight?" Evelyn sipped her wine gracefully. "Surprisingly tolerable," she mused. "Though I can't say he enjoys losing." Damien chuckled. "And what exactly is he losing?" Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Control." A low ripple of laughter spread through the group. Alexander had heard enough. He strode forward, his presence alone silencing the conversation. Damien looked up, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Ah, here he is. Your charming husband." Alexander didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on Evelyn. She looked too damn comfortable beside Damien. His hand curled into a fist, his chest tightening with something dark and unfamiliar. "Come," he said, his voice low, commanding. "We're leaving." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to speak with your friends." Something about her defiance made his blood burn. He leaned down, his lips brushing dangerously close to her ear as he murmured, "I don't like sharing, sweetheart." She shivered. He felt it. But instead of giving in, she whispered back, "Then maybe you shouldn't have married me for a bet." His patience snapped. Before she could react, he gripped her wrist, pulling her to her feet. The guests watched, whispering, intrigued. But Alexander didn't care. All he knew was that he didn't like Damien looking at her, didn't like the way she smiled at other men. And most of all, he didn't like the fact that he cared. They barely made it into their bedroom before the argument exploded. "You don't get to drag me away like some object, Alexander," Evelyn snapped, pulling her wrist free. He turned on her, his eyes dark with an emotion even he couldn't name. "Then stop acting like you enjoy making me jealous," she scoffed, arms crossing. "Jealous? Of what? Damien? You think I want him?" Alexander clenched his jaw. He didn't know what he thought. All he knew was that when he had seen her with Damien, something inside him had snapped. "You're my wife," he growled, stepping closer. Too close. Evelyn refused to back down. "Only on paper," she whispered. "Or have you forgotten that?" Silence. Then he kissed her. Hard, possessive, a clash of fire and control. She gasped against his lips, but she didn't push him away. Instead, her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer. It was a battle neither of them wanted to win. Heat, frustration, desire. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Evelyn stared at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "This is dangerous," she murmured. Alexander's lips curled into a slow, wicked smirk. "Then why don't you stop me?" Evelyn swallowed hard. But she didn't stop him. And that was all the answer he needed. That night, as Evelyn lay beside him, her body warm against his, Alexander knew something had changed. This wasn't just a bet anymore. This wasn't just a game, because he didn't want to let her go. And that was the most dangerous realization of all. Alexander Knight was not a man who allowed himself to feel vulnerable. But tonight, as he lay awake beside Evelyn, he felt dangerously close to losing control. The kiss they had shared earlier still burned in his mind. It had been more than just frustration, more than just a game. It had been real, and that terrified him. Because Evelyn Sinclair was not just any woman. She was a woman with secrets, a woman running from enemies, a woman who could ruin everything he had built. And worse, she was becoming the one thing he could not afford to lose. The next morning, Alexander stepped into his study, only to find an anonymous letter waiting on his desk. The paper was thick, expensive. No signature, no sender, just one line of text. "Your wife is lying to you." His blood ran cold. He turned the letter over. No clues, no seal. But the fact that someone had managed to place it inside his private study without anyone noticing meant one thing. Whoever sent this was powerful and dangerous. His jaw clenched. Evelyn had told him the truth about her past. But had she told him everything, or was she still hiding something? That evening, Alexander had a meeting scheduled with Damien Calloway and other business partners. He should have been focused on the multi-million-dollar deal they were about to finalize. But all he could think about was Evelyn, the way she had walked into his life, unexpected and impossible to ignore. The way she had made him care. He was still lost in thought when Damien leaned in, his voice low and taunting. "You know," Damien murmured, "I always thought you were the smartest man in the room." Alexander tensed. "And?" Damien swirled his whiskey glass, a smirk playing on his lips. "And yet, you married a woman you know nothing about." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you getting at?" Damien chuckled. "Come on, Alexander. You don't seriously believe that Evelyn Sinclair just happened to end up in your path, do you?" A sharp, icy feeling crept up Alexander's spine. "What are you trying to say?" Damien leaned back in his chair, exhaling dramatically. "She didn't marry you because she had nowhere to go," he said lazily. She married you because she needed you. Alexander's pulse pounded in his ears. Damien's smirk widened. And now you need her. Alexander stormed into the mansion, his head filled with anger, doubt, and something dangerously close to fear. He found Evelyn in the library, sitting beneath the soft glow of candlelight, flipping through an old book. She looked peaceful, too peaceful, as if she hadn't just turned his world upside down. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" His voice was sharp, slicing through the silence. Evelyn looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Telling you what?" He stepped closer, towering over her. "That you didn't just marry me to hide." She exhaled softly, closing the book. "So, you found out." His hands curled into fists. "You used me." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "And you used me," she said simply. "Or have you forgotten the reason you married me in the first place?" His jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong, but this felt different. "I need the truth, Evelyn," he demanded. "No more games." She stood, stepping closer. Too close. "All right, Alexander," she whispered. "The truth is, I didn't just marry you for protection." Silence. "I married you because the men who ruined my family, the men who want me dead." She looked up at him, golden eyes burning. "Some of them are your allies." Alexander felt the world tilt beneath him. He had suspected it, but hearing it aloud, knowing the people he trusted might be the same people trying to kill his wife, his mind spun with rage, betrayal, and something deeper. Something terrifying. Because if Evelyn was telling the truth, then he had only two choices. One, cut ties with her. Leave her to her fate, protect his empire, his fortune, his reputation. Two, stand by her side. Risk everything to protect her. Turn against men he had done business with for years. The answer should have been obvious. He should have walked away. But as Evelyn held his gaze, her breath uneven, her body tense, her expression finally vulnerable, he realized something. He couldn't. Alexander's voice was low, dangerous. "Tell me everything." Evelyn hesitated. "If you do this, if you help me, then I'll be making enemies," he finished. She swallowed hard. "Yes." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Alexander made his choice. He lifted his hand, gently tilting her chin up. His fingers lingered against her skin, his touch too soft, too dangerous. His next words sealed their fate. "Then let them come." Evelyn's breath hitched, and as Alexander pressed his lips against hers, claiming her in a way that left no doubt of his intentions, he knew that this wasn't about a bet anymore. This was about her, and he would burn the whole world down before he let anyone take her away. For the first time in his life, Alexander Knight was choosing someone over power. Evelyn had told him the truth. The men who had destroyed her family, ruined her name, and wanted her dead were the same men he had done business with. He had spent years building his empire with these people, shaking hands with devils. And now, because of Evelyn, because of this woman who had started as a bet, but had become something far more dangerous to him, he was about to betray them all. Alexander and Evelyn had spent the night in his study, going over every name, every business partner, every ally turned enemy. Evelyn sat on the edge of his desk, one leg crossed over the other, flipping through documents with sharp, practiced movements. "You don't trust easily, do you?" Alexander mused, watching her from his chair. Evelyn smirked. "Numbers, should I?" He chuckled darkly. "Probably not." A silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of what they were about to do. "You know," she murmured, her voice softer now. "You don't have to help me." Alexander exhaled, leaning back. "And let you fight this alone?" Evelyn glanced up at him, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And for the first time ever, neither was he. That evening, as Alexander prepared for a high-profile business gala, something felt off. His instincts, the same instincts that had made him one of the most feared men in the business world, were screaming at him. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. Evelyn stepped into the room, now wearing a sleek black dress, her hair falling in soft waves down her back. She looked like she belonged in high society, because once she had. Alexander walked over, adjusting the clasp on her bracelet. His fingers lingered. "If anything happens tonight," he murmured, "stay by my side." Evelyn's lips curled slightly. "Are you worried about me, Mr. Knight?" His eyes darkened. Yes. For once she didn't tease him, because for the first time she was afraid too. The gala was in full swing, the ballroom glittering with chandeliers and champagne glasses. Powerful men and women mingled, whispering secrets behind polite smiles. Alexander kept Evelyn close, his hand resting lightly on her lower back, possessive, protective. And then the room shifted. A man stepped forward, Damien Calloway. Alexander stiffened immediately. Damien's smirk was smug, knowing. He lifted his glass. "Well, well," he drawled, "hiding something, Alexander." Evelyn went still beside him. Damien's eyes flickered to her. Or rather, someone. Alexander felt the room grow colder. His enemies were already making their move. They barely made it out of the gala alive. The moment they left the ballroom, a car sped toward them, its headlights flashing like death itself. Alexander shoved Evelyn out of the way just as the car crashed into a row of parked vehicles, exploding into flames. Guards pulled their weapons. Chaos erupted. Evelyn gasped, staring at the fire, the attempt on her life. Alexander pulled her against his chest, his grip unrelenting. "We need to go. Now." She didn't argue, because this wasn't just a threat anymore. This was war. They reached the mansion just before dawn, the events of the night still heavy between them. Evelyn stood by the fireplace, arms wrapped around herself, her golden eyes shadowed with emotion. Alexander poured himself a drink, then set the glass down untouched. For the first time since this all began. He didn't want alcohol. He wanted her. He walked over, his voice quieter now. "They won't stop, Evelyn." She turned to him, and for once he saw it. The fear, the exhaustion, the weight she had been carrying alone for years. "They won't stop until I'm dead," she murmured. Alexander reached out, tilting her chin up. His touch was gentle but firm. "Then I'll make sure that never happens," he said fiercely. Evelyn swallowed, her breath uneven. "Why are you doing this?" His thumb brushed her cheek, his heart pounding with a realization he couldn't ignore anymore. "Because," he said, "I don't want to lose you." Evelyn's breath hitched. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she reached for him first. Their lips met, not in battle this time, but in surrender. A kiss filled with fear and longing, with fire and promise. And Alexander knew in that moment, this was no longer just about revenge, this was love. Dangerous, unstoppable, unforgivable. And he would burn the world down before he let anyone take her away. The world outside was in chaos, but inside Alexander's mansion, time seemed to stand still. Evelyn lay curled against him, her breathing steady, her warmth seeping into him as though she had always belonged there. Alexander had never been one for attachment. Love was weakness. Feelings were distractions. But Evelyn, she had burned through his defenses like wildfire. She had gone from being a bet to a mystery, to a necessity. And now he would kill for her, die for her, protect her at all costs. His arms tightened around her as his mind raced through the events of the last 24 hours. The attack at the gala, the car explosion, the betrayal. This wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. This was about war. And Alexander Knight never lost a war. The next morning, Alexander received a message. A single envelope. No name, no signature. Just a chilling demand. Deliver Evelyn Sinclair by midnight, or prepare to lose everything. He stared at the words, a slow, burning fury rising inside him. They thought he would hand her over, They thought he would betray her to save himself. They thought he was still the man who only cared about power. They were wrong. He crushed the note in his fist and turned to Evelyn, who was watching him carefully. "They're scared of you," he murmured. Her lips twitched. "Good." Alexander exhaled. "We end this. Tonight." By the time night fell, the mansion was surrounded. Men in dark suits, weapons in hand. They weren't just here to negotiate, they were here to kill. Alexander stood at the top of the grand staircase, Evelyn beside him. His men, the most loyal, the most ruthless, stood ready. "You don't have to fight for me," Evelyn whispered. Alexander turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're my wife." His voice was low, raw, absolute. "This is my fight too." Her breath hitched. For the first time, she saw it. This wasn't about protection anymore. This was love. Fierce, terrifying, real. She reached up, pressing a soft, fleeting kiss against his lips. Then, as gunfire erupted outside, they prepared to face the storm together. The battle was brutal. Bullets tore through the night. Men fell. Blood stained the marble floors of the mansion. Alexander fought like a man possessed, his only thought. Evelyn must survive. Then, the betrayal came. One of his own, a man he had trusted for years, turned against him. A gun was pointed at Evelyn's back. A whisper of movement. A second too slow. A shot rang out. Evelyn gasped. Pain, burning, blood. She collapsed into Alexander's arms. His mind went blank, his heart stopped. And then he unleashed hell. Alexander didn't remember killing the man who shot her. All he remembered was rage, a fury so deep it drowned everything else. By the time the gunfire stopped, their enemies lay in ruins. But Evelyn, she was slipping away. Alexander carried her inside, his hands stained with blood, hers and his enemies. "Stay with me," he growled, pressing his forehead to hers. "Damn it, Evelyn, you don't get to leave me." She smiled faintly. "Bossy as ever." He let out a broken chuckle. "Yeah, well, get used to it." Her fingers curled weakly around his wrist. "I already have," she whispered. And then, darkness claimed her. She woke up to soft sheets and sunlight streaming through the windows. Her entire body ached, but the warmth beside her was unmistakable. Alexander. He was asleep beside her, still in the same clothes from the night before, exhaustion lining his face. She reached up, tracing his jaw. His eyes opened instantly, sharp and alert, but when he saw her awake, something in them softened. "You scared the hell out of me," he muttered. Evelyn smirked. "I'm still here." He exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, before she could say anything else, he kissed her. Not like before. Not desperate, not hungry, but soft, slow, meaningful. When he pulled back, his voice was low, rough. "Marry me again," Evelyn blinked. "What?" "For real this time, May," he said, holding her gaze. "No bets, no games." Her heart pounded. "You don't have to." "I want to," he cut her off. "I love you." Silence. Then Evelyn laughed. Software, beautiful, free. And as she pulled him back down to her, kissing him with every emotion she had been too afraid to name, she whispered back, "I love you too." A year later, Alexander Knight was no longer just a ruthless billionaire. He was a man who had fought, bled, and nearly lost everything for the woman he loved. Evelyn stood beside him, a ring on her finger, a crown in her own right. They had built something together, not just power but trust, not just wealth but love. And as they stood at the top of the world, rivals feared them, enemies respected them, but most importantly, they had each other, forever.